A very good afternoon to everybody joining our session today. This is number 3 actually of our 4-part series all around supply chains in action. I've got the pleasure today to be joined again by Colleen and Rory from Ardea International. Hello, guys. And I also welcome in Laura from our Italian team. Hi, Laura. Thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Hi, Vicky. Hi, y'all. Thank you for inviting.
So, listen, a little bit of housekeeping and some background before we go into the sort of panel discussion. For those of you who joined session 2, you'll remember that we were focused a little bit more on the implementation of policies and processes and things. So that kind of phase. Today we're actually looking at how do we ensure that the things that you guys are doing are actually effective. So we're going to look at how do we actually measure what comes out of these audits, because it's not just about collecting data, we know that. So we're going to dive into that a little bit, which then leads us into our final session. So a couple of bits of housekeeping. You will be muted just to help the discussion come along. The chat function is disabled, but please do use the Q&A function, which is at the top of your screen. We leave some time at the end for any of your questions, and we'll take as many as possible there. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers and we're going to get right into the discussion. Colleen, let me come to you from beautiful South Africa. Good morning. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Vicky, and hello, everybody. It's a delight to be here today. And yes, I am in South Africa. It's not as sunny as I'd like, but it's certainly not raining. My name is Colleen Tron. I'm a tri-qualified lawyer and the founder and CEO of Ardea International. And we are a specialist sustainability, business and human rights consultancy with expertise in modern slavery. And I'm delighted to be here today.
Thanks, Colleen. Laura, perhaps we could come to you next.
Yeah, so here I am. Greetings from Italy from my side. So Laura Ruggeri, I'm responsible for all of the CSR, the CSR certification and assessment services within Bureau Veritas Italy. So very happy to be here with you today to discuss about auditing and social auditing.
Super, thank you, Laura. Rory, last but not least, please.
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. Good afternoon, everyone. Slightly unfortunately from a very grey UK today, but I'm Rory Oak. I'm a senior consultant with Ardea International. I'm a lawyer by background and I've been with Ardea for just over 6 years. And my work focuses on supporting clients across different sectors on human rights and sustainability due diligence. And that includes quite a lot of work around developing frameworks and systems for monitoring the effective implementation of due diligence and checking what's working. So very much looking forward to discussing that today.
Super, thank you, guys. And I'm Victoria. I'm your moderator, I guess, for the series. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all and have our speakers with us. Let's get straight into things, shall we? Colleen, I was interested at the UN Forum for Business and Human Rights. It was commented that 90% of effort goes into measuring risk and only 10% into measuring the outcomes. Why do you think, in your experience, companies struggle to measure whether their due diligence is actually working?
Thanks, Vicky. And as always in the series, when we are posed a question like that, the challenge is really how you might ring fence it and just come up with something that's slightly nuanced given the size of that kind of question. So I think, Vicky, what it is that many companies are good at identifying their risks. So they are learning more to look at risk assessments. They're using audits, various mechanisms to identify their risk, but they are much less comfortable asking about whether their responses are actually effective. Only a small minority of companies can demonstrate that they systematically track what their human rights due diligence, whether their human rights due diligence is effective. And you've referenced the UN Business Forum on Business and Human Rights, but actually if you look at the World Benchmarking report, the statistics there are that under a third, and often closer to less than 20% of companies, depending on the indicator, measure the effectiveness of what they do. And I think actually a lot of that has to do with two things. Yesterday I was asked a question by someone on what we see as effective due diligence. And I think it's a really interesting question because obviously part of effective due diligence is continuous improvement, monitoring, and tracking. And for many businesses, they don't necessarily know how to answer that question. So they're not going into the monitoring and the tracking. And of course, it's much harder because we know that it's easier to send a code of conduct to all your suppliers, ask them to sign it up. Perhaps that's linked to your contractual terms and conditions. But much more difficult for companies to work out how that obligation by signing and giving cognizance to someone's supplier code of conduct is actually being implemented.
Okay. What should they be asking instead, Colleen?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. And I think, I mean, just to say, a lot about monitoring effectiveness, continuous improvement is set out now in legal obligations. It's required under the OECD and the UNGPs. So companies with large amounts of volumes of auditing data, questionnaires, certifications, are often treating it just as an activity. It's just, an activity which is a tick box. It doesn't necessarily look at the effectiveness. So to answer your question, it requires asking different questions and things like, are my risks decreasing? Am I mitigating my risks appropriately? Are workers actually experiencing improvements? Are there reoccurring issues? And if there are reoccurring issues, are we addressing the root causes? I think might have been in our last webinar with Vicky, where David might have mentioned that there are, he's seen some issues where, some companies have had the same non-conformities arise for 20 years. Now, what that says is people aren't asking the right questions. They're not looking at what are the trends exactly. So I just think we need to have that shift towards, holistic systems where monitoring risk becomes a reporting issue rather than just a management tool.
Agree. Laura, you see a lot of these things from a technical perspective. What are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah. Thinking exactly from a technical perspective, monitoring is challenging because supply chains, they are global, they are complex, and they are constantly changing. So companies do have visibility into like their direct supplier, and that's relatively easy, let's say. But we all know that many of the risks, and probably most serious risks, sit deeper in the chain, like in the second or third part of the supply chain. And therefore, companies sometimes do underestimate the effort in terms of coordination and in terms of stakeholder engagement that is required to build a robust monitoring system. So we are talking about engage suppliers, have reliable data flows, have an internal system that is able to analyze trends across different suppliers, different products, different regions. So this can be complicated, and sometimes companies just go for the most common solution, which is social audits. And social audits can help because they can identify non-conformities, but still they just capture a snapshot in terms of a snapshot in time. And we know that the audits alone have never produced a sustainable improvement in terms of social performance over time.
And it's interesting, Laura, just listening there. Communication is obviously so important. But in your experience, how do you keep your stakeholders engaged during this?
Yeah, I think stakeholders stay engaged when they feel heard, when they are really on board on a project, and ideally a project that is delivering impact that is meaningful for them. So the idea here is to have a framework of that allows, let's say, a constant exchange with your suppliers, ideally with the community. You should ideally have like a two-way feedback, and should be very clear what the goal is, and how and why this cooperation is so precious to finalize and to reach the goal.
Yeah, it's about context setting, isn't it? You know, making sure people understand the reason why. I agree, Laura. Laura, I'm going to stay with you, actually. Social audits, we know they're one of the most widely used monitoring tools still today. What can people realistically achieve with that? And where do typical social audits fall short?
So social audits, I think so far have played a key role in terms of raising awareness on labor conditions and on most common gaps that are identified from a social perspective. And they like audits do help companies to understand what the baseline of a supplier compliance is in terms of compliance with private code of conducts or international standards. They totally help with identifying non-conformity, especially for what is visible. I'm just thinking about like health and safety, like fire exit or PPE distribution, and in terms of labor law compliance with the local CBA that can be applied. Looking from a third-party perspective, social audits are really helpful in terms of credibility and reliability and transparency. So in these terms, social audits are helpful, and there are ways to have a social audit program to be as much effective as possible and as much reliable as possible. I'm thinking about including unannounced audits, to, of course, include confidential interviews with the workers, to have a gender-sensitive approach, and not only during the audit, but also when you plan and made up the audit team, so the team of auditors. Some standards and some code of conducts also require the companies to have a management system in place. And this can be really helpful in terms of ensuring an ongoing conformity, to the sustainability requirements that you include. So, and these features that I just mentioned are included in the most common schemes that you find here in the slide. So the most known and most famous social auditing schemes do include these aspects. So I'm thinking about SA 8000, but also SMETA. And that you have also here mentioned the two newborn social management system schemes. One is PAS 24K that has been published by BSI, and FSSC 24K that builds on the PAS standards. So these aspects are included in, let's say, in these schemes. Here I just mentioned a few, and it's included also the reference to the ITC standards map, so that people can have much more access to the full list of social schemes that are available worldwide. But as you mentioned, there are limitations for any social audits. You might have, let's say, a lack of disclosure from the supplier, and this can be because, for instance, supplier might fear some penalties, and this triggers the fact that you have limited visibility during the audit. I've seen cases where, for instance, you have gaps identified during the audit, but then the suppliers might lack the capacity to address and remediate the issues that come up in a sustainable way. in other situations, I've seen that, for instance, the issues that arose from the audits are actually systemic, so they are beyond the control of the individual supplier, because they are linked to the social context, to the regulatory environment, or these might be also related to industry-wide issues. As a last limitation, I'm thinking there are also lack of incentives sometimes for the supplier to address the social performance issues, because sometimes this require quite an effort, and they might don't really see the benefit, or they might need some additional incentives to do that. So for all of these reasons, I think audits are fundamental and they are very useful, but these are not the only tool to be used for a monitoring system. This should be used to build a much broader system, I think.
Yeah, so audits have their value, they have their place, but it's not a standalone thing that solves every potential blind spot or challenge. Makes perfect sense, Lara. Rory, you tend to look at this thing through a slightly different lens. What are your thoughts on this particular subject?
Yeah, it's a slightly different lens. I mean, I completely agree with you, Laura. I think you know, the role of social audits can be massive and very important, but I really liked that last point you mentioned about the broader monitoring system that it needs to sit within, you know, to get the most out of any audit program. Because in our interactions with clients, I think we do engage with audits from a slightly different perspective. And I think those limitations that you mentioned really come to light when there isn't a proper due diligence system that sits around an audit program.
Okay.
You know, when I say proper due diligence system, I think it's just that point that maybe Colleen mentioned, that it's not just a question of whether audits are happening, but it's how the audits are actually being, how the outputs of the audits are actually being put to use in practice. You know, we see lots of companies getting great reports and identifying lots of issues with their audits, and they're regularly commissioned and everything, but then there's not that extra piece of evidence to show that the findings are actually being reviewed and prioritized or acted upon. And that's where the risk starts to emerge for a business, because the audit doesn't show that you've got a system in place. And it can actually show that the company had the knowledge of the risk but didn't do anything, which is quite significant when you're looking at in the context of things like CSDDD. You know, at that point, your audit outputs go from being a safeguard for the company to potentially becoming evidence of having inadequate due diligence. So I still believe that more companies should be using audits, but the monitoring question, to slightly piggyback on what Colleen said earlier, you know, it's not did we audit, it's what did we do with what the audit revealed in the end. And that's where we're seeing more of a shift in the approach now. So companies starting to build systems that link audit findings to corrective actions and remediation, to a proper root cause analysis, and then developing this clear thread of follow-up and monitoring over time. And that's essentially seeing the audit not as the end point of the process, but just the very starting point for actions that they need to take after that.
It's a really important point you make, Rory. You know, not that ignorance is ever a defence in any of this, but actually if you have demonstrated that you can see where those challenges are and you've done very little with them, it's potentially quite a problem, isn't it? And, you know, in fact, a lot of our clients mutually, we're finding that is the headache of all of this, isn't it? Yeah, couldn't agree more. Laura, I want to come back to you. Okay, so we're saying that audits on their own, they're not enough, they're not sufficient on their own. What does a more effective monitoring approach look like?
Yeah, as I was mentioning, we have to combine with other monitoring tools. And I think all of the tools that we can think about should go into the direction of building trust with the suppliers, with the community, and to create, I would say, enabling factors. So we should, instead of focusing on simply identifying the non-conformities, we should work with the suppliers to develop some plans and track the progress over time. I'm just thinking about some examples that I've seen so far. The first one that comes in my mind is actually about collaborative assessments. And here I'm thinking about like what you have in the organic world. You have the participatory guarantee systems. This could be somehow applied also with from a social point of view. You could have like community-led assessments that are led by and carried out by community liaison reference persons. Secondly, another option is to have continuous improvement programs, meaning that once we have worked with the suppliers to reach the actual compliance, then we keep on having like a proactive conversation on how to continue to improve and how to further improve the situation. So we can then integrate capacity building. We can then cooperate with civil society organization. We can cooperate with other brands and with other multi-stakeholder initiatives in order to further improve the situation. Another aspect that can be really helpful is to implement an effective grievance system, as the grievance mechanism it's something like an early warning system that can identify, it can help identifying issues before they actually escalate. So, and this can be valid both at the supplier level, but also at the brand level, at the global brand level. So the idea is to pass from pass-fail compliance to a continuous improvement and partnership.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that, you know, the theme that's coming through to me at least is the audit is one part of this. It is not the entire solution. Yeah, absolutely clear. Laura, thank you. Colleen, what are you thinking about? Oh, you're on mute, Colleen. Sorry, I think you came off and went back on.
I must have. Yeah, thank you, Laura. You know, so interesting to hear about, you know, looking at how you might redesign an audit process. And, you know, from our perspective, we are really interested in, you know, how companies can demonstrate effective due diligence, how we can support them to do that, which means aligning their efforts to the OECD requirements, more particularly now to CSRD, CS3D, so all legislative requirements and the UNGPs. And of course, what that really means from a practical point of view is that your monitoring efforts have to be linked to your risks. You need to be able to report on them. So we are trying to work with our clients to encourage them to take a step back and do two things. First of all, think about what do they need to know more about. And when you start asking that question, what do I need to know more about? You have to start thinking about how you prioritize your risk and what that risk is and how you build your risk mitigation system if you are particularly interested in how you might mitigate your legal liability, manage your reputation effectively. And what that might means from a company perspective is looking at what are your salient human rights risks. And I think that we spoke about this in the first session where we talked about double materiality, you know, being a good view from CSRD to get a sense of, you know, what are your critical issues. But actually within that, what are your salient human rights and how have you identified the risk, whether it's forced labor, whether it's gender issues, whether it's discrimination, because once you start knowing that, then you can start designing a system which looks at due diligence incorporating not only audit, but effective monitoring, systematic identification of risks and reporting on them. And I think what Laura also mentioned, just to pick up on, is that importance of stakeholder engagement. I love that you said, Laura, the fact that, you know, stakeholders stay engaged when they feel heard. And I think if one has to look at what's going to shift in the next 3 to 5 years, it is going to be designing more effective due diligence systems with better effectiveness tracking and much more engagement from stakeholders.
I agree, and I think, you know, I think about the clients that I work with. It's really important that businesses understand it is not just the sustainability manager, it is not just the supply chain manager, it is the entire business. So I think that's coming through loud and clear. Right, guys, thank you. Really interesting stuff. Rory, I want to come back to you on something. How can grievance mechanisms and stakeholder engagement strengthen monitoring and early warning systems?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one, because I think in terms of due diligence, to me, grievance mechanisms are often quite misunderstood, particularly at a site level. We often see them treated as just complaint channels or a formality that has to be there, where you put up a poster and say, you know, employees can phone this hotline to make a complaint. But exactly as you say, and Laura mentioned, they are a really valuable early warning system. In that they give you visibility of negative impacts as they're happening, or even before they fully materialize, rather than after the fact, which is that completely different insight that you get from tools like Audits, which tend to be periodic and retrospective. And that's such a key thing for proactive ongoing monitoring, because you're almost getting, you know, live feedback rather than a month or two later when you actually conduct that check or that visit. But also in the same way as with any tool, and like I was saying with Audits, I think it's really important that the grievance mechanism, in order to play that role effectively, it needs to function effectively in line with the rest of your due diligence processes. It's not enough for it to just exist in isolation. I think it needs to be something that is promoted and made accessible to the people it's intended for, and it needs to be safe for them to use it, and it needs to be responsive and quickly responsive when issues are raised. Essentially, that's asking, you know, does it meet the effectiveness criteria that we've got here on screen, which are the UNGP's effectiveness criteria for grievance mechanisms, and they're a really practical guide that I would definitely recommend anyone involved in grievance mechanisms to take a look at. But and we've highlighted the source of continuous learning aspect there, and I think that's where it really fits into your monitoring aspect of due diligence. It's making sure that what comes back from the grievance mechanism is actually analysed and considered in terms of, what does this tell us about our due diligence. We've seen examples where companies had repeated complaints about working hours and recruitment practices, and they pointed to systemic issues that weren't being addressed by the mitigation measures that they had in place, and they also weren't picked up by other risk assessments that they'd done. And I think that's where the link back to due diligence becomes really critical, because they're a great tool for checking whether your due diligence is actually working in practice. Absolutely.
And you're right, the responsiveness of this, you know, doing something with it. It's like we're talking about, don't do an audit and do nothing with what you find. Don't have a grievance mechanism, but be slow to respond, or actually non-responsive.
Yeah.
Laura, what do you think when you listen to Rory's views there? Have you got some thoughts on this element?
Yeah, well, I totally agree with what Rory shared. Here I'm also like duplicating a bit. It's what you just mentioned, but grievance mechanism can be super valuable in terms of providing and bring to light, let's say, issues that otherwise come may remain hidden, might not be captured during the audits. And so when the workers or the communities do share their concern, when they feel safe, then the company have an increased visibility into problems they didn't know before, or they didn't were fully aware. However, the grievance mechanism work well when they are trusted and when they are accessible, and as Rory was mentioning. So this means that we have to provide multiple channel to people. We have to be stakeholder sensitive, and here I'm thinking about gender perspectives, minorities, migrants, worker. We have to understand what their perspective might be in order to for this to be easily accessible for them. We have to think about anonymity, accessibility. We have to ensure the confidentiality of the tool, and we have to communicate and explain how the tool will work and how the complaint will be handled. Of course, from a brand perspective, then we will have to review what comes out of the grievance mechanism to understand if there is any pattern or any systemic issues that needs to be identified and addressed. Again, and here I'm going back a bit with the point that I mentioned before of building trust. From a general perspective, the grievance mechanism works effectively when the relation with the stakeholder is built on dialogue, on openness, on transparency, and here the clear message must be like, we are in this together. We are here to hear your concern, and we are working on this together. So then it can become really helpful.
Not one part of the business or one person's job, right? That's kind of what we're talking about. Laura, I want to stay with you actually. How should companies ensure that monitoring does actually improve their due diligence system?
Yeah.
Big question.
Exactly. Then I think we can all agree that monitoring creates value when it feeds back into the decision making. So we have to regularly review the data. We have to identify systemic issues, dynamics, systemic risks in order to address those in a systemic way, and then to take into consideration when we are taking decisions. So when we take decisions, it means that we have to adapt the company behavior in terms of social impact. And this, for me, this has like three main aspects. So the first is that we don't only have to work on a corrective actions plan with the supplier, but most importantly, we have to think about remediation, because HRDD is also about remediation. So due diligence is about remediation also, and to think about preventive actions. And this is where the decision making it's important, because then we have to think, how should I change my behavior to avoid that this might happen again? So preventive actions and remediation. Second is about management review. So we have to see how we use the outcome of the data, of the indicators that we have, to change company behavior. So we have to see if maybe we should adapt and change the company KPIs in order to, so how do we set the goals and our KPIs, so that so what do we mean by success in the end? This is valid both at the company level, so KPI at company level, and also personal review KPIs. So I'm talking about directors KPI, managers KPI, so personal performance review. This ideally companies should be able to link the role performance to the also social impact, as if they want to improve the social impact of the overall company. A third aspect that I'm thinking about is that one of the most powerful leverages is to have an impact along the supply chain, is to think about what my purchasing practices are. So we should see if the company can adapt the purchasing policies and practices in order to support the social the effort in terms of social sustainability that their supplier are doing. So I think that this helps ensuring that the monitoring becomes then learning, and this can be then applied as a changes in the company behavior and in company way of doing business.
And there's got to be that willingness, right? You know, if you find something that makes you change course slightly or reprioritize, there's got to be that kind of willingness to do that, right? You've got to kind of react as you find. I think that's really important, Laura. Colleen, we talked a little bit in another forum actually about feedback. Can you share some thoughts based on Laura's comments there about your thoughts on feedback and the importance of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, Laura's points are absolutely correct. You know, this using audit to gain visibility of what particular issues are there, but then from a due diligence perspective, ensuring that you close that feedback loop. So we've seen that all too often. I think Rory's also mentioned it, where, you know, companies have got non-conformities or failed social compliance audits, and actually they may do some actions, they might not do all of them, but they lack the feedback loop, and they lack perhaps even at the corporate strategic level. And I think this is also something that's really key that I'm noticing more and more, is that, well, actually all through my career around business and human rights, is that there can be a real gap. I call it an execution gap between your strategy and your operations. And, you know, where at one level there's a strategic requirement for, let's say, effective due diligence. At an operational level, there might just be how do we just keep things ticking over? But actually, for effective due diligence, and to build on what Laura said, you need that feedback loop. So your monitoring findings should be going back to the right people to prioritize your decision making. And Laura mentioned, you know, the procurement team. If your procurement team is looking at cutting costs all the time, but actually your sustainability KPIs are to ensure that you have longer term relationships, because that might feed into better working conditions. You can't have two KPIs that exist alongside each other that are going to contradict each other. So that those findings need to be fed back into strategic decisions across the business. There also needs to be looking at, you know, what kind of policy updates are needed. I mean, it's quite interesting. We do a lot of benchmarking, deep dive on policies and statements, modern slavery statements as well. And so often you see commitments or statements that perhaps don't reflect what's happening in practice, or because you might have updated your system, but you haven't fed that through in your statement, or you're making commitments without the underlying process that has to support that disclosure. And I think, you know, monitoring and effectiveness is a key part of that, because if you are looking at, let's say, your remediation strategies, you are going to want to be getting feedback from your grievance mechanisms. Companies that are saying that there are absolutely zero accounts in the grievance are probably ones that are not or haven't enabled real trust in those grievance mechanisms for workers to be able to complain, so they can see what the issues are. And of course, when you look at the results of your audits and your monitoring, that's going to help you prioritize your future risk assessments. So, you know, it very much, I always think of the OECD cycle with the 6 steps and, you know, closing that loop. It's the same as, you know, the basis or the principle of when we what we decided to do around the series, which is to follow, plan, do, act, check. So it's ensuring it is a continuity in what you are doing. Yeah, and I also just think this is very critical when we're talking about managing your reputation and legal liability. I do think that the Dyson case that was settled 2 weeks ago should be a wake-up call for lots of organizations on what went wrong. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have a precedent in law as to what was settled and on what grounds, but certainly we know that there was enough coverage that there must have been some lack of looking into worker conditions in supply chains.
So listen, the things that I'm hearing loud and clear is stakeholder engagement is critical to all of this. You know, an audit, a social audit is super. We've seen some great examples of that, but on its own, it's not enough. and we've got to provide some feedback loops. Okay, quick reminder to our audience before we move to a couple of examples. You are able to use the Q&A function. If you've got any questions for the guys, please do start to send them through and I'll get to as many of those as I can. Rory, give me a quick time check, please. What time are we on?
We're at 1:38.
1:38, we're doing well, super. So listen, we've talked a lot about the limitations of, you know, the social audit itself, but I think, Rory, you've got a great example actually about where monitoring broke down actually. Do you want to talk us through that for a few minutes?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think just a quick example that really illustrates that point of how things can go wrong. It was a client who was a US-based client sourcing from a site in Indonesia, and that site had failed a social compliance audit. And our client wanted to go a step further, and they weren't just asking what did the audit find, they wanted to understand what actions had been taken in response and what the root causes were. So they asked us to go on site and engage directly with the workers and the site management and take a closer look at what had actually happened in response to the audit findings, whether changes were being implemented and monitored properly. And that's where we found a perfect example of a monitoring breakdown, because one of the audit findings related to drinking water safety, and the site had responded by commissioning a third-party water test, and on that basis the issue had been marked as closed in their internal tracking system. But when we looked more closely at what they documented and everything, it turned out that nobody had actually reviewed the results of that test. And when we did, the results showed us that the water was still unsafe, but no further action had been taken. So on paper, the issue had been resolved, the box had been ticked, if you like, but in reality, the underlying risk hadn't been resolved at all. And I think this really highlights where monitoring breaks down and the impact that can have, and where the focus is on completing an action by commissioning that test rather than verifying whether the action actually resolved the problem, because there's no feedback loop. No one was clearly responsible for checking on the outcome. There was no system in place to check if it was genuinely resolved. And I know it sounds almost obvious in hindsight, and I don't highlight it to say, look how silly this site management was to miss it. I think these things do often get missed if there's no system in place, and if you imagine you have an assortment of corrective actions to manage all across different aspects of a site. It's something we see quite often, where corrective actions are treated as the end point rather than, right, we're going to take this action and that's the beginning of a monitoring process, where we're going to ensure accountability and follow up and keep monitoring until you can verify that improvement's actually been made and the issue's been addressed.
And it's interesting, isn't it, when you say the obvious? Isn't that where people get caught out?
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
Actually human nature is when it's the obvious, bit of complacency could kick in, couldn't it, Rory?
Yeah, 100%.
So listen, Laura, conversely, I think you've got a really interesting, thank you, Rory. You've got an interesting example, I believe, about monitoring that has worked well. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to share this nice examples, as recently we had some clients. They were already quite active on let's say on due diligence, on monitoring. So they had a code of conduct. They were monitoring suppliers, but then they wanted to go the extra mile, let's say, and they wanted to how we were saying, they wanted to close the loop. They wanted to start to learn from the data and from the outcome of the supplier monitoring program, let's say. So they were thinking about how to embed sustainability within their procurement, because this is like the idea came because they had conversation with the suppliers, and they came to the conclusion that actually part of the problem, part of the causes and part of the issues were the actual cause was also led to the role of the buyer's own purchasing practices. Some other reasons were related to the orders from other buyers, from other international factors, but still there was a role for in terms of the company purchasing practices, and therefore they wanted to think about potential solutions. So they found a solution with using and made, let's say, referring to the ISO 20400. This is a guidance on an ISO guidance on sustainable procurement. So this ISO guidance actually provided a framework with the key steps for all of the company functions to how to review their purchasing practices. What the company did was first a deep procurement analysis. They were analyzing supply chains, the risks. They did a cost analysis, need analysis. They analyzed the market supply, the stakeholder input, of course, and then they took all of these results to redesign and implement a management system for their procurement. So they wanted to align their procurement with their sustainability objectives. They drafted a policy, a strategy, like for each management system, you have to draft a policy and then the strategy. They clarified what the governance was, the accountabilities. They gave themselves objectives in terms of sustainable procurement. They revised the procedures and allocated the necessary resources and directly engaged with the stakeholders in terms of what to select for KPI, for monitoring and reporting. This is about the management system setup. And then also from an operational point of view, they reorganized the procurement activities. So they redefined the procurement criteria in terms of supplier selection. So they revised the criteria for the evaluation procedure. They made sure that these criteria were not excluding like small suppliers. So they were trying to combine inclusivity, let's say, with sustainability, of course. They found a way to manage the purchasing contracts and to monitor the performance of on the contracts. So this they made good use of the ISO guidance. In this way, let's say Bureau Veritas' role was to actually carry out an assessment on the way they designed their system to actually check if this was aligned with the ISO or not. And I think that in this sense, being this ISO, let's say just a guidance, you have no must, you have no shall. So every company can try to adapt and try to find the way to make good use of the suggestions and of the inputs that you will find in this guidance to review your procurement system in order to make the procurement to support the sustainability goals. We had several types of customers implementing this system, from services to manufacturing, so really like different fields. For all of the let's say the sectors, it came out and it was useful. Of course, being a guidance, the result could vary, could be very different. You could be like at the beginner level, so probably the result of an assessment in this case would be that we might identify some gaps compared to the ISO, but it still would give some ideas on how to further improve the system. But also many of the companies, I think, the result was at the intermediate level, with a few only reaching the advanced level with sustainability fully integrated into their procurement processes. So this was just to mention an example and a useful tool, in my view, for the companies who actually want to see how to to change the procurement methodology to support the sustainability goals.
It's really well structured, it's clear, isn't it, in terms of being able to follow something that we can see has worked really well. Laura, thank you for sharing that. Can you believe we are rapidly approaching the 3-quarter mark? So at this point, let me stop sharing the slides. Actually, Colleen, it's a lot to think about, isn't it? It's been a deep discussion. If there were a couple of things for our audience to really take away from today, what would they be for you and why?
Yeah, thank you for that. It has been such an interesting discussion. And I just actually, before I just give those two, and I am conscious of time, I think what Laura had said about the ISO, the procurement, sustainable procurement ISO is useful because for those of you listening, there is a British Standard 27500, which is around guidance on modern slavery for organizations. I was part of the committee that developed that and part of the ISO development of that will be released in July. It's a free guidance. So again, if you're looking for something that will just help you put, gather your thoughts on how you might start addressing things like modern slavery risk, it's a useful piece of guidance. To answer your question, I mean, of course, Vicky, these conversations are always so interesting.
60 seconds, Colleen, just because I've got a couple of great questions, please.
Okay, sure. Monitoring must demonstrate effectiveness. Not just activity. I think that's key. The focus on what companies can show. So UNGPs know and show. Audits and monitoring data create legal exposure if they're not acted on. I think that's critical as well. And effective monitoring requires feedback loops and documented decision making. Those are my 3 points. Nicely written.
Perfect. In even less than 60 seconds. Thank you. Laura, 60 seconds. What do you want people to remember from today?
Yeah, so as a main takeaway, the first would be that we understood that the audits are necessary but not sufficient. These have to be integrated with a broader monitoring approach. The second is that effective monitoring combines several tools and several data sources, and the key aspect is to engage with the stakeholders to build partnerships with suppliers, communities, and this is really the turning point in terms of effectiveness. The third part, I would say that we have to turn, this is the last part of our conversation, so we have to find a way to turn monitoring into learning.
Yeah.
And for me, monitoring means changing the company practices accordingly, specifically in terms of KPI and procurement.
So let yourself pivot depending on what you find. I agree.
Yeah.
Guys, thank you so much. We've got a couple of questions to go through. I don't think I'm going to get to all the questions we've got, but if I don't get to your question, firstly, I apologise, but we will give you a written response directly, but I'm going to try and get through as many as I can. So let's go into our Q&A. First question, Colleen, I'm going to come to you with this one, but guys, please compliment as you need to. Question here, how would you recommend rolling out a grievance mechanism when our supplier says they already have one? Should we request access to theirs or add ours? I think there's more to that question. It feels wrong to add an additional one that may confuse the workers, but using their own is also a conflict of interest.
Yeah, I think a very interesting question and probably merits a lot more thought as to the structure. I think in response, in the first instance, it's a question of what do we mean in that context to a grievance mechanism. If we're talking about just a whistleblowing hotline, that's quite different. I think that, a grievance is more than just a whistleblowing hotline. There's different mechanisms that can be put in place for a business to develop, to be able to demonstrate effective mechanisms. So what we found in this context is that whilst you might have your suppliers having effective grievance mechanisms, I think there's the step back again is, how much leverage do you have? What is the system that they have in place? What kind of feedback are they going to be giving to you? But actually going back to your own responsibility under CSDDD, under the UNGPs, every company should develop its own effective grievance mechanism. And that might mean having a remediation protocol in place, a framework for you as a business that really sets out quite clearly what your mechanisms are, and then considering what are you expecting to get from your suppliers? How is that information fed through, so that you are going to have visibility of what your suppliers are doing, or that you are going to take certain actions with. So I'm sorry, it's a question that I don't think can be answered very easily. I do know that the conflicts around whistleblowing is ongoing, and a lot of organizations still struggle with that in respect of, you know, retailers all having their own whistleblowing system. And how I've seen some organizations are dealing with this is looking at leverage. You know, what leverage do you have? Can you collaborate? I don't know if Rory, you want to add to what I've just said.
No, I think that covered more or less everything. The only one thing I would maybe mention is just, you know, you've mentioned that the supplier says that they've got one. Maybe if you don't know much more else about their grievance mechanism, a good starting point might be to assess their mechanism against the effectiveness criteria that we talked about, and actually get an understanding of how well is it working, is it safe and independent enough in practice, and then kind of choose a direction from there, knowing your starting point.
Thank you, guys. Laura, I'm going to come to you for our next question, actually. Do you have any recommendations for how smaller companies could manage going beyond audit with limited teams and resources at their disposal? What specific actions would you start with in the context that we already have an annual auditing process for all Tier 1 and major Tier 2 suppliers?
Wow, okay.
Good question, right? Yeah.
Yeah. That's already a good start with having the process for Tier 1 and Tier 2. For small companies, I think one option could be to work in teams with other companies. You might have multi-stakeholder projects or working groups. There might be working groups active within the region for that specific product. So the focus might change a bit. You might check what is already active, and maybe in order to see what could going beyond the audit, probably I would suggest something related to the last part of my intervention, like did you already have an audit program? How did you take into account the feedback and the results of the audit to actually change? Was there some result that indicated that, for instance, you could change your purchasing habits or the KPIs? So something that, you know, to close the loop and to go in the direction of learning and changing the company behavior. So this could also be an idea.
Can I add to that?
You can.
Vicky? Yeah,
You can.
okay. I think that's such a good question, and a question back perhaps to the person asking this is a question as to whether you have mapped your own due diligence actions against the OECD requirements, for example. So, you know, it sounds quite rudimentary, but actually many businesses we work with haven't really considered what the 6 steps might be. You know, what are you currently doing? So, you know, it could be just understanding whether you have the correct policies in place. What are the commitments? How do you identify and assess risk beyond audit? Do you have a specific question set around your suppliers? How is that weighted? How would you articulate who are your higher risk suppliers? So there's a number of ways that you can go about developing that effective due diligence structure. But if you really stuck on resources, it's possibly just going to look at that diagram, thinking about what you internally can do on that. For us at ARDIA, we have a human rights due diligence maturity assessment. It's quite an easy tool, checklist and engagement we use. We find that it's mapped against OECD and CSDDD. So it becomes something that we can just help even smaller companies to just get an understanding of how they might go beyond what they've already got in place.
I'm glad you added in, Colleen. It's a very relevant comment. And can you believe actually we're right at time? We've got a couple of minutes. So at this point, a reminder for everybody joining, I hope you've managed to join sessions 1 and 2 as well. We have our final session on the 22nd of April with one of our UK colleagues, Myresh, who I actually see is in the call. So Myresh is one of our senior sustainability consultants there. Colleen and Rory come back. Laura, thank you so much for joining session 3. You do get a copy at the end of our series. You get an entire wrap-up pack. So you'll get some key takeaways from each of the 4 sessions, recordings of the sessions, and please do register for the 22nd of April. We hope to see you there. From Laura, Colleen, Rory and I, stay safe, have a wonderful day, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you, everyone.
much
Thank you all.
again, Vicky, for facilitating, and have a
Welcome.
great day. Thank you,
See you
everybody.
guys. See you.
See you guys.
Bye.
See you.
Bye.